On June 6th, Politico reported on a Democrat versus Democrat squabble between Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti and Arizona Senator Mark Kelly. Garcetti's deep desire to be confirmed as ambassador to India and Kelly's refusal to give him a stamp of approval are at the root of the Dem-on-Dem smackdown. Kelly and other senators are refusing to confirm Garcetti because of accusations that the LA mayor was aware of sexual assault and harassment allegations made by some members of his staff against his former advisor Rick Jacobs. Garcetti has denied he knew anything about it. Of course, that brings up the question, should he have known about it? I would say he should have, but that's just one woman's opinion. Either way, he was either complicit or ignorant, and neither is a great look for a man who wants to represent the United States' interests in the world's second most populous country. Politico based its report on 5 unnamed sources familiar with Garcetti's ambassador outreach. They say Democrat power brokers have threatened Kelly with being cut off from national-level donor money if he doesn't relent. Kelly is up for re-election this year, and his seat is considered to be vulnerable. Garcetti, of course, is the ranking Democrat in the city of Los Angeles, home to his party's most lucrative and glitzy fundraising events. However, he has denied that he is behind the strong arming of Kelly. Meanwhile, Kelly's spokesman, Jacob Peters, said there is a, quote, 0% chance he'd be intimidated by this, end quote. And joining us now to discuss is the president of the New York Young Republican Club, Gavin, and also joining us is Tipping Point producer Chris Boyle. Thanks for being here tonight, guys.
Thank you for having me.
Great to be here.
Great. So this might sound like a niche story, but you both believe there's actually something more to be said here. So first, Gavin, let's go to you. We have seen out-of-district money influencing races more and more. Is this perhaps an example of just how blatant some of that influence has become?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we need to reform how money is treated in our political process. We have a problem at the local, state, and national level where essentially elections are bought and paid for, candidates are bought and paid for, and consequently, our elected officials are bought and paid for. That is the corruption of our republic. And I firmly believe that if you can't vote in a certain race, you should not be able to donate in that race. Maybe it's radical, maybe it's crazy, but I think getting a lot of this influence out of the political process and putting it back to the constituents and their wills and desires is going to be a healthy reform needed to return sanctity to our republic. But look, I also love to see Democrats at each other's throat and fighting each other. So I'm definitely going to try to see if we can throw some fuel onto this fire.
It is absolutely wonderful. And I know, Chris, you have a lot of numbers even sharing on social media, kind of digging into just how incredible this phenomenon has grown into. Can you share some of that with us?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when you look at the degree to which every single race down the ballot is funded by outside money, but especially in congressional races, it's led to a real class of activist congresspeople that are just out there fundraising instead of representing their constituents. And unfortunately, at the top of the list, we see some of the biggest Democrat names, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's raised somewhere around $15 million. Less than, around 90% of that, more than 90% is coming from people outside of her district. The same can be said for Katie Porter, Ilhan Omar, Adam Schiff. The list goes on. The reality is we have to divorce all of this outside spending from elected representatives that are supposed to represent their constituents and make it so these people are really accountable to the people that are voting for them and the people that are funding their campaigns. And to think that Hollywood would be able to influence campaigns all the way over in Arizona when Hollywood is the epicenter of some of the worst policies we've seen. I recently had my wife's grandmother visit from the Philippines, and she wanted to go visit Hollywood, and she thought it would be this beautiful place, sort of the center of American culture. I was ashamed to take her through there, and now Garcetti wants to be our ambassador to other countries. It really just goes to show why people need to be involved in local races and why local politicians should be accountable to the people they represent.
And so, Gavin, going back to you, looking at how all this big money, how it affects local races, can you dive into some of that for us? Because one example that stands out in my mind, as I remember covering in 2019, some of the races going on in Virginia that year. I remember seeing Michael Bloomberg, he was a big key figure, and then, of course, a lot of other gun control, gun grabbing types were heavily involved in some of the local and state races going on in Virginia. And that really helped to bring it home to me, because I thought to myself, have any of these people even lived in Virginia? And yet here they are really dictating the terms to the voters, what they see, what they hear before they go to the polls. So Gavin, talk to me about some of the effects this has on local communities when this big outside money comes wishing in and out, depending on whatever the political flavors are that day at the national level.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at some of these local races, they're in media markets, pretty small media markets, and you bring in a lot of these outside funds and they can completely monopolize the entire media in that particular jurisdiction, that district. And it has massive impacts on these elections, and it's completely not fair. It's not a system that is built around the principles of our country, of our Constitution. It's a principle. It's based around the principles of simply buying out elections, buying out candidates, and influencing it through any means necessary, rather than listening to their constituents. And the constituents can simply be won over with enough paid programming. I mean, we see how the left-wing control of institutions such as the mainstream media has had a massive impact on the psyche of the American body politic. With you control the levers of the narrative formation process, you effectively control the levers of government and power. And that's what we're seeing when you allow unlimited outside funds to be pouring in to different races and districts from, wherever it may be, including from foreign donors, from foreign countries, from foreign interests. I mean, a lot of countries, many countries in the West and the developed world have put restrictions on this type of financing of elections. And we should be looking to do the same. And I think it would be a very necessary reform to bring us back to our roots as a republic.
So, Chris, Gavin talks about reform. Is there any specifics that you would have in mind when it comes to reform? Is there any way we can actually really tackle this?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the first things that you could do is actually limit campaigns' abilities to fundraise from outside of their district. If you'd limited fundraising to people within the district, fundraising limitations have already been put in under McCain-Feingold. It's nothing new. It's nothing strange to the Constitution. Right now, candidates can only raise up to a certain number of dollars from individual donors. Simply extend that limitation to anyone outside the district. And when it comes to political action committees, outside spending, just say, hey, anyone spending politically has to stipulate that they're outside the district. That way people know. I mean, when you look at some of these people, especially look at Gavin, you're over there in New York. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I mean, how big is her district? It's in the Bronx, some other places. It can't be that many square blocks when you really get down to it. She's able to raise millions and millions of dollars, upwards of 90% from people she doesn't even represent. That's going to drown out anyone from that neighborhood who's going up against her. There's going to be absolutely no chance for them to actually represent the people that are on the ground. So this is something that needs to be tackled immediately, and it's going to affect both parties. That's the truth of it. It's going to affect both parties, but it's going to be for the good of the American people and for the good of constituents who don't have their voice heard and feel just bombarded by political messages.
Chris, great points. Oh, yeah.
I would add to that the fantastic reforms that Chris is proposing. I would add, strip the individual limits if you live in district. If you live in district, donate as much as you want. And if you live out of district, you can't donate at all. And then obviously we can probably discuss the particulars with different organizations. I like the stipulation idea. But I think if you live in the district, you shouldn't have any restrictions. And, that is your district. That is your representative. That is the person that is going to be governing that area in the case of an executive office. So if that were the case, open up the limits, get rid of the limits entirely, but put much stronger controls on outside money. I think that's a fair, common sense, good government reform that, while it will impact both parties, as Chris mentioned, it also should be supported by factions in both parties.
Great points there. And Gavin, last question before I let you both go tonight. Since we are talking about districts, a big component of this is the lines and how they get drawn. Of course, after the 2020 census has been taken, has been counted, we're seeing a lot of districts now being redrawn somewhat. And I know you just won a big case yourself when it comes to, I believe it was assembly districts in your area. Can you speak to that for a moment?
Absolutely. I mean, on to the particulars of my case. Obviously, the Democrats were caught gerrymandering pretty massively in New York at the congressional, Senate, and Assembly levels. The courts here in New York miraculously ruled against the congressional and Senate maps. They left off the Assembly maps, which is the lower house of the state legislature. The reason they did it was because 14 corrupt rhinos in the state assembly, which is a super minority of a super minority cut a deal with the Democrats to pad their own districts at the expense of a fair map overall. It was a disgusting deal. We took them to court. It was a long process through different courts, different systems, but we eventually got a victory, and those maps are going to be tossed out for the next election cycle. So we're happy to see that victory. And as far as the districting process in general, I mean, there's plenty of reforms we can make. I think we need to obviously strip representation based on non-citizens. That was something that has come up in the past few years. I would push for something like the Wyoming rule, which would make the districts all equal in size based on the smallest state, which in this case is Wyoming. And look, at the state level, in a place like New York, being a Republican in New York, I would advocate for things like proportional representation in New York, that is, not federally, because that's the only way I see as an effective means to break the Democrat monopoly of power in this state, because the first past the post system here in New York is obviously going to benefit the Democrats, so we have to be a little creative. So there's a lot of different strategies at the state, local, and federal level that can be implemented, both to improve representation, to break up political monopolies, and to make sure lines are drawn fairly and for the better representation of the people that live within them.
Well, Chris, Gavin, thank you for the very interesting conversation tonight. Thanks for joining us tonight, both of you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having us on.